There is a type of fat living inside your body right now that you have never seen, never felt, and probably never thought about, and it is doing far more damage than anything visible in the mirror. Most people spend their entire lives worried about the fat they can pinch, the softness around their hips, the layer that sits just beneath the skin and shows up when they wear certain clothes. But that fat, the kind you can see and touch, is almost innocent compared to what's hiding deeper inside you. Buried beneath your abdominal muscles, wrapped silently around your liver, your intestines, and your most vital organs, there is a completely different kind of fat operating by its own rules. It doesn't sit quietly the way surface fat does. It doesn't wait patiently to be burned off with a few good weeks at the gym. Instead, it behaves more like an active biological saboteur, constantly releasing chemical signals, flooding your bloodstream with hormones, and quietly rewiring the way your entire body processes energy, stores sugar, and responds to the food you eat every single day. This is visceral fat, and understanding it might be the most important thing you do for your health this year. What makes visceral fat so uniquely dangerous isn't just its location deep inside the abdominal cavity, it's the way it communicates with the rest of your body. Scientists describe it as metabolically active, which sounds clinical and dry until you understand what it actually means. It means this fat never stops broadcasting distress signals throughout your system. It constantly releases inflammatory compounds called cytokines, chemical messengers that travel through your bloodstream and interfere with the normal function of your liver, your pancreas, your heart, and your brain. Think of subcutaneous fat, the soft, visible kind, as a quiet storage unit sitting in the corner, doing almost nothing. Now imagine visceral fat as a malfunctioning alarm system wired directly into your body's control panel, screaming at full volume around the clock, whether you're awake, asleep, eating, or resting. That is a closer picture of what's actually happening inside millions of people who have no idea this is even occurring. But the most insidious part of visceral fat isn't the inflammation alone. It's the specific relationship this fat has with your liver, and the destructive cycle that relationship quietly creates over months and years without a single visible warning sign. Because of where visceral fat is physically located inside your body, it drains directly into something called the portal vein, the major blood vessel responsible for carrying nutrients from your digestive organs straight into your liver. This anatomical proximity is not a minor detail. It means that every single time visceral fat breaks down and releases fatty acids, those fatty acids travel directly to your liver before they go anywhere else in your body. Your liver gets hit first, every time, whether it needs that fuel or not. Over time, this constant flood of uninvited fatty acids overwhelms your liver's processing capacity. Your liver begins to struggle, and one of the first things to suffer is its ability to respond normally to insulin, the hormone responsible for telling your cells to absorb glucose from your bloodstream and use it for energy. When your liver becomes resistant to insulin signals, blood sugar regulation begins to break down. And here is the cruel twist in this biological story. When your liver stops responding properly to insulin, your pancreas compensates by pumping out even more insulin, trying to force the message through. Higher insulin levels then signal your body to store even more incoming energy as fat, specifically in the abdominal area. So visceral fat literally encourages the creation of more visceral fat. It builds a closed loop, a self-reinforcing cycle that silently expands your waistline from the inside out. While your blood sugar climbs, your energy becomes less stable, and the risk of serious metabolic disease quietly grows with every passing season. Most people don't realize they're caught in this loop until their doctor hands them abnormal blood work results, or their belt size has quietly jumped 2 notches. Now here is the part that almost nobody expects when they first learn about visceral fat. Despite everything just described, the inflammation, the liver disruption, the insulin resistance, the self-reinforcing cycle, visceral fat is actually more responsive to the right kind of exercise than the surface fat you spend all your time worrying about. This sounds almost unfair, but it is backed by a significant and consistent body of research. Visceral fat is uniquely sensitive to improvements in mitochondrial efficiency, to changes in insulin signaling, and especially to a specific type of low-intensity aerobic exercise that most people either underestimate or skip entirely because it doesn't feel hard enough to count. That exercise is Zone 2 walking, and the reason it keeps appearing in study after study focused on deep abdominal fat loss is not coincidence. It is because Zone 2 training targets the precise biological mechanisms that make visceral fat both dangerous and ultimately accessible as a fuel source. You are about to understand exactly how and why it works in a way that no amount of intense daily exercise will replicate. When most people picture an effective workout, they imagine something that leaves them breathless, soaked in sweat, and completely spent. Fitness culture has spent decades convincing the public that effort should be visible and loud, that the burn, the gasping, the heavy exhaustion are signs that something real is happening. Zone 2 training doesn't look like any of that. Zone 2 is a walking pace that feels genuinely easy, almost surprisingly so. You can hold a full conversation at this pace without gasping between sentences. You feel warmth building in your body, your breathing deepens noticeably, but you never reach the point of struggling to keep up with the oxygen your body needs. From the outside, it looks like a casual stroll, but inside your body, specifically inside the microscopic structures within your muscle cells called mitochondria, something extraordinary is happening. Mitochondria are the energy factories of your cells, tiny structures responsible for converting the fuel you consume into ATP, the usable energy molecule that powers every biological process in your body. At high exercise intensities, mitochondria are pushed past their preferred operating range, and your body compensates by switching to faster but less efficient energy pathways that rely heavily on carbohydrates and produce metabolic waste products like lactate. Zone 2 keeps you right at the edge of that threshold, in the sweet spot where mitochondria can work at their ideal pace, using oxygen efficiently and drawing heavily on fat as their preferred fuel source. Researchers studying energy metabolism have a name for this range. They call it the fatty acid oxidation window, and it is the precise intensity level where your cells are most actively and efficiently burning fat. Not just any fat, but the stored fatty acids being released from tissue throughout your body, including from the visceral deposits wrapped around your organs. The key insight that changes how you think about this is what Zone 2 does over time, not just during a single session. Every time you train in this zone, you are sending a consistent metabolic signal to your mitochondria, a repeated instruction that says fat is the primary fuel you need to get better at processing. Mitochondria respond to this signal in a measurable and documented way. They multiply. They increase in both number and efficiency. Studies consistently show that regular Zone 2 training over several weeks produces a meaningful increase in mitochondrial density inside muscle cells, which directly translates to a higher capacity for fat oxidation, not just during exercise, but at rest, during sleep, and throughout the ordinary movements of daily life. This is not a small or trivial adaptation. A body with more efficient, more numerous mitochondria becomes a genuinely different metabolic machine, one that progressively pulls more fatty acids from circulation and from stored fat deposits, including the visceral fat that has been quietly accumulating around your organs. The process compounds quietly over weeks and months. You won't feel fat disappearing during a single walk. That is not how this works. But the biological machinery being built during every Zone 2 session is laying the groundwork for a metabolic environment where visceral fat has increasingly fewer places to hide. Now, one of the most common reasons people fail to benefit from Zone 2 walking is that they never actually reach it. They walk too slowly, moving at a pace that barely elevates the heart rate and produces no meaningful adaptation. Or they walk too fast, pushing themselves into a higher intensity zone where carbohydrate burning dominates, cortisol rises, and the prolonged fat-oxidizing environment they need never fully develops. The good news is that finding Zone 2 requires no equipment, no heart rate monitor, no laboratory test, and no expensive technology whatsoever. Your own body gives you everything you need to identify it precisely and reliably. The most well-known indicator is called the talk test. At true Zone 2 intensity, you should be able to speak in complete flowing sentences without pausing to catch your breath between words. But you should not be comfortable enough to sing. If you can belt out a full chorus without losing your rhythm, you are moving too slowly. If complete sentences require effort or leave you breathless, you have crossed into a higher zone. The sweet spot sits right between those two experiences. A second and surprisingly accurate indicator is nasal breathing. At Zone 2 intensity, you should be able to breathe exclusively through your nose for extended periods, though it will feel slightly effortful and attentive to maintain. The moment nasal breathing becomes genuinely difficult or impossible to sustain, when your body demands more air than your nose can deliver, you have pushed past Zone 2 into territory where carbohydrate burning accelerates and fat oxidation decreases. This shift happens at a specific and consistent physiological threshold that aligns almost perfectly with Zone 2 in the vast majority of people. The third cue is temperature. Your body will feel noticeably warmer than at rest, and you may begin to feel faint moisture on your skin, but you should not be dripping sweat or feel overheated. This warmth corresponds to the level of metabolic activity where lactate in your muscles remains low and stable, another hallmark of true Zone 2 training that researchers use to confirm the zone in laboratory settings. Once lactate begins accumulating meaningfully, you have crossed out of Zone 2 and into work that is valid for different purposes, but not optimal for the deep, sustained fat oxidation you are building toward. If you feel all three of these things at once, conversational but not casual, nose breathing that feels slightly challenged, and warmth without excessive sweat, you are almost certainly in exactly the right place. Now let's talk about what happens at the cellular level during these walks, because this is where the science becomes genuinely fascinating and where the specific connection to visceral fat becomes undeniable. When you enter Zone 2 and maintain it for an extended period, your mitochondria begin preferentially oxidizing fat molecules. Initially, at the very start of any exercise session, your body draws primarily on stored carbohydrates, muscle glycogen, and circulating blood glucose, because these are fast, readily available fuel sources that require less oxygen to convert into usable energy. But as the session continues and your intensity stays steady within Zone 2, your body's carbohydrate demand decreases relative to what's available, and your metabolism begins shifting toward fat utilization. This transition typically takes anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, depending on your current fitness level, your insulin sensitivity, how recently you last ate, and how consistently you have been training. For someone in their first week of Zone 2 walking, this shift might take the full 20 minutes, meaning the fat-burning phase of a 30-minute walk is relatively brief. But for someone who has been practicing consistently for 2 or 3 months, the metabolic transition happens far faster, sometimes within the first 5 or 6 minutes, because their mitochondria have been repeatedly trained and have adapted to the signal. This is one of the most encouraging aspects of the entire process. The adaptation is not just about burning more fat during exercise. It is about your metabolic system becoming faster and more efficient at accessing fat as fuel, including visceral fat specifically. Because of the direct connection visceral fat has to circulation through the portal vein. When metabolic conditions strongly favor fat oxidation, as they do during Zone 2, visceral fat becomes a particularly accessible and willing fuel source. Consistency is what unlocks this adaptation over time, and this is where most people either succeed or quietly give up. One of the most persistent misconceptions about Zone 2 walking is the belief that sessions need to last 60 minutes or longer to produce any real benefit. Research does not support this. Meaningful improvements in abdominal fat and metabolic health markers have been documented in people completing sessions as short as 30 minutes, provided the intensity is correct and the training is repeated consistently over several weeks. What matters far more than session length is weekly total volume. Studies pinpoint a range of approximately 150 to 210 minutes of Zone 2 activity per week as the threshold where fatty acid oxidation capacity, insulin sensitivity, and mitochondrial efficiency begin showing scientifically measurable improvement. This is not a magic number that works for everyone identically, but it represents a consistently reliable starting point across a wide range of populations, fitness levels, and ages. You can distribute those minutes however fits your life. 5 sessions of 30 minutes, 3 sessions of 50, or even daily shorter walks of 20 minutes. Your body doesn't care about the packaging. It responds to cumulative exposure to the stimulus over time. For people who push toward 300 minutes per week, research specifically examining metabolic syndrome shows sharper and more dramatic reductions in visceral fat. But even starting at 150 minutes produces real, measurable changes in the metabolic environment that directly reduces visceral fat over weeks and months. The connection between Zone 2 and insulin resistance deserves its own careful attention, because it reveals another dimension of how walking at this specific intensity breaks the visceral fat cycle from a completely different angle. Visceral fat and insulin resistance reinforce each other in a destructive loop. The more insulin-resistant your muscle cells become, the more aggressively your body converts incoming energy into abdominal fat rather than using it for fuel. And the more visceral fat accumulates, the worse your insulin resistance becomes. Zone 2 walking disrupts this loop at the root. At this intensity, your muscle cells increase their ability to absorb glucose from the bloodstream without requiring large amounts of insulin to force the process. This means the hormonal pressure toward fat storage decreases directly and measurably with every consistent Zone 2 session. Over weeks of regular training, glucose uptake becomes more efficient, blood sugar fluctuations flatten, and the chronic hormonal environment that has been driving abdominal fat accumulation gradually shifts in your favor. There is also a hormonal benefit that rarely gets discussed but matters enormously for visceral fat specifically. Zone 2 training keeps cortisol, your body's primary stress hormone, significantly lower than high-intensity exercise. This is not a trivial distinction. Cortisol is one of the most powerful signals your body uses to justify holding onto deep abdominal fat. From an evolutionary perspective, the body interprets chronically elevated cortisol as evidence of an ongoing threat, scarcity, danger, sustained stress, and responds by defending visceral fat stores as emergency reserves. High-intensity training that spikes cortisol repeatedly can inadvertently trigger this defensive mechanism, making visceral fat more resistant to mobilization even when overall calorie burn seems high. Zone 2's gentle, sustained nature avoids this entirely. It creates the metabolic demand for fat oxidation without sounding the hormonal alarm that tells your body to hold on to its deep reserves. A few practical adjustments can meaningfully amplify all of these effects without adding complexity or requiring major lifestyle changes. The single most impactful timing adjustment is walking before meals, or at minimum, a few hours after your last meal when insulin levels have had time to settle. In the post-absorptive state, when glucose and insulin are not elevated from a recent meal, your body shifts more readily toward fat oxidation right from the beginning of a walk. Research comparing the same Zone 2 workout performed before versus after a meal documents a significant increase in fat oxidation when the walk is performed in the pre-meal or fasted state. For many people, a morning walk before breakfast becomes not just the most convenient option, but also the most metabolically effective window for visceral fat reduction. The second adjustment is pacing consistency. Small unconscious fluctuations in walking speed, slowing to check a phone, speeding up when a thought catches your attention, pull you in and out of Zone 2 repeatedly, reducing the total time your metabolism spends in the fat-oxidizing environment you have worked to enter. Maintaining a stable, deliberate rhythm throughout the entire session significantly increases cumulative fat oxidation, and people who pay attention to this one detail often notice faster progress than those who walk the same total time but with inconsistent pacing. The first signs that this entire process is working will probably surprise you, because they won't come from the mirror. They come from inside, from the way your body functions throughout the day. Stable energy that carries you smoothly from one meal to the next without the crashing fatigue that used to hit mid-afternoon. Fewer intense cravings in the hours between meals. Breathing that feels noticeably easier during walks that previously required more effort. These are not placebo effects or wishful thinking. They are direct reflections of the mitochondrial and insulin sensitivity improvements happening beneath the surface, measurable on laboratory equipment, weeks before any change shows up around your waistline. Most people begin noticing physical changes around the 6-week mark. Clothes fitting differently around the midsection, less bloating, a gradual softening of the abdomen that no amount of visible body fat loss produces on its own. These changes are slower than what intense programs promise, but they are trustworthy in a way that rapid transformations rarely are. Visceral fat, reduced through consistent Zone 2 training, stays off, because the metabolic adaptation that drove the reduction continues operating long after any single session ends. When progress eventually slows, and it will, because every adaptation eventually stabilizes, the solution is almost never a complete overhaul. Adding one additional Zone 2 session per week is often enough to restart visceral fat mobilization.